Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Businesses Fit for 1.5 event. This is a second event of the series, and this time we will be focusing on the innovation toward a climate neutral economy. My name is Gosia Rechlik, and I'm a Communications and Strategy Manager at Climate Reality Europe, so the organizer of today's event, and I will be hosting it and moderating today. And as Climate Reality Europe, just a few words about the organizer now. As Climate Reality Europe, we are the European branch of a global organization, the Climate Reality Project, that was founded and chaired by Mr. Gore, the former Vice President of the US and a Nobel Peace Prize laureate. We are a volunteer-based organization, so we basically train climate activists. So we turn individuals into climate activists to take grassroots climate action. We have about 40,000 members across the world and approximately 4,000 in Europe alone. And these individuals come from all walks of life. Many of them represent the business sector. And this is why we have created this series of events, Businesses Fit for 1.5, as well as other initiatives, to support those individuals and encourage them to become their internal climate activists or entrepreneurs, if you will, who accelerate climate transition plans in their organizations. And now, today, we will have about 4 hours together. We will host keynotes, interviews, panel discussions, workshops, and networking sessions. And I will speak more to that as a bit later. But before I do so, we would like to share a message from the founder of our organization, Mr. Al Gore, who couldn't be with us today virtually because of the time difference. But he wanted to share a message with all the participants of today's event. So I would like to now invite Mr. Gore's video message to the stage.
Hello, I'm Al Gore, the founder and chairman of the Climate Reality Project. Thank you for joining the Business Fit for 1.5 Degrees event, which is graciously hosted by a dedicated group of volunteers and staff from the European branch of the Climate Reality Project. I want to thank the team that put this event together, as well as extend my thanks to the wide variety of European changemakers who are sharing their wisdom as speakers during today's event. Allow me to briefly introduce the Climate Reality Project to those of you who may not be familiar with it. Our team at Climate Reality is on a mission to catalyze global solutions to the climate crisis by empowering people across every sector of society to become effective climate champions. By growing the grassroots movement for climate action around the world, we believe that we can help change the world for the better by working to prevent the most catastrophic impacts of the climate crisis and to do so in time. So you perhaps won't be surprised when I tell you that I'm here today to recruit you. We've seen important progress from political leaders who are developing policies that move the clean energy transition forward, but the private sector has an equally important role to play. Indeed, the climate crisis will have an impact on every aspect of our lives, our jobs, our businesses, and every organization that we belong to. It is a crisis that must be met with a scale and scope of responses equal to the challenge that this crisis presents. That means that all of us must strive to foster the transition to a clean energy future in every area of our work and our lives. And we must move quickly. This is the most important decade of action in our lifetimes. As many of you already know, the European Union has set a target to reduce emissions 55% by 2030. That means that across every industry and sector of the European economy, businesses must quickly begin their shift toward sustainability. This transition can certainly seem like a daunting task, especially in carbon-intensive industries. But what gives me hope for this transition is that We already have the solutions we need to reduce emissions quickly and dramatically. And not only do we have the solutions, we know that deploying those solutions will ultimately benefit businesses, their employees, their communities, and the planet. The shift toward a cleaner, more sustainable future, the sustainability revolution, is happening at the scale of the Industrial Revolution and the speed of the digital revolution. Energy markets are being transformed at a staggering pace, and innovation is happening across every sector of the economy. Businesses are rethinking transportation. Innovation in the agricultural sector is poised to play a significant role in reducing emissions. Advances in material science and engineering are helping to reduce the carbon intensity of our buildings and roads. As a result, the opportunity for businesses to lead this transition is truly massive. The direction of travel in our global markets is already very clear. But I'll be candid with you, while many businesses have been ambitious about setting climate goals, we have yet to see the necessary follow-through. That's the key. Fewer than 25% of the world's public companies are now on track to achieve their emissions reduction goals. So if we are to avoid the most catastrophic impacts of the climate crisis, we must limit global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees C. And to do that, we have to cut global emissions in half by 2030. The science is clear. We have no more time left to waste. But I have faith that we will get there, and it's in large part because of all of you. We can build a better world through your work. It all starts with the initiatives that you'll be discussing today and that I hope you'll bring back to your organizations. Whether you switch to renewable power at your facilities, use your purchasing power to build a market for sustainable products, network within your sector to share successful strategies, or work with policymakers to advance industry-leading sustainability practices, we need it all. Your influence in the business community matters a lot. All of us here at the Climate Reality Project are very grateful that you have joined this conversation today. My wish is that you will leave this event today with plenty of inspiration and hope. And if you ever lose hope about our ability to solve the climate crisis, just remember that the will to act is itself a renewable resource.
Thank you, Mr. Gore, virtually. So as you can see, we cannot emphasize more how important it is for businesses to take climate action. And today we have about 4 hours together, during which we will have some inspiring sessions and the opportunities for you to connect with each other. So first we will start with a session on innovation fit for purpose. This session will explore the concept of innovation fit for purpose, that is innovation that paves the way to a climate neutral economy. And we will also learn the current state of business transformation toward the goals of the Paris Agreement. And as Mr. Gore mentioned, it is not going as well as we would wish it to do. Then we will follow with a panel discussion on business case studies. Here we will explore solutions that support business organizations in the transition toward the Paris Agreement objectives. The solutions in question center around energy efficiency, supply chain management, and the use of technological advancements in greenhouse gas emissions reduction. So these are both from the SME, so the small and medium enterprises, and corporate perspective. And then these sessions will consist of 4 presentations, 15 minutes each, and a 30 minutes panel discussion. Then we will move to a climate scenario simulator workshop, a so-called En-ROADS workshop, which was created by the Climate Interactive and MIT. And this tool is an interactive exercise to explore what levers should be pulled and what policies should be implemented to ensure that we keep the global warming below 1.5 degrees. During the event, you have the opportunity to connect with the other members of the audience in our networking space, but we encourage you to leave that part towards the end of the event itself. So once all of the sessions end, also the workshop, you will have about 30 more minutes until 2 p.m. today to connect with other audience members. So we encourage you to leave that part towards the end of the event today. So now, without further ado, we would like to move to the first session, that is Innovation Fit for Purpose. And our first guest is Dr. Kirsten Dunlop. She is the CEO of Climate KIC, a European knowledge and innovation community that works to accelerate the transition to zero carbon economy. And Kirsten will talk about the need for systemic change, the use of innovation in that process, and the ways in which Climate KIC facilitates that transition to a net zero economy. So Kirsten, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Kosia. Thank you. And good morning, everybody. Welcome. Thank you very much for taking your time to try and make sense of what you can do as business leaders and as facilitators of business transformation. I'm going to share my screen. Let me just work on that right now. So I hope just confirm, Kosia, you can see the slide? Hope so. Okay.
Yes, we can see it.
You can. Fantastic. Okay, so I want to start with a little scene setting. I'm going to talk about three things. I'm going to do a little scene setting on context, because I think context is extremely important for any business to understand, and most particularly not only context that is current, but the net present emergent future context. The context is just around the corner that any business strategy and kind of adjustment mechanism, innovation response needs to be aiming for and engaging with. I'd like to talk about what it means for businesses to deal with the context of climate crisis and climate emergency and planetary crisis more broadly, how to change and how to shape and deploy the way we innovate to enable businesses to survive, to enable businesses to transform core business models and core practices of human existence, as you heard Al Gore call for, and to enable them to thrive. And I'm going to give you a little bit of a context of where that's happening in the work of an organization like Climate KIC, which in itself constitutes a market-making context and market-making structure and framework for businesses within Europe and globally, potentially. So the thing I would, just a couple of context pieces I'd really like to start with. One is around a reality with respect to where we are on emissions and the trajectory of greenhouse gas emissions and warming, global warming. It is really important for us not to misunderstand in all of the ways in which we're receiving reports that we are already locked in to a 1.5 degree of global warming of overall, and most probably at this point 2 degrees by 2050, because of the latent effect of the emissions already emitted into the atmosphere. So for us to bend the curve of emissions in the way in which we're describing, to stay anywhere near the Paris Agreement objectives, we need to do extremely radical change. Otherwise, and in a context where we are experiencing these kinds of constant collateral intertwined effects, a set of intertwined wicked crises that make it even harder to act and even harder to work out how to steer a course, a steady course. So it means that we need a couple of things. We need to design for a state of permanent crisis, and we need to comprehend and understand what does systemic mean and why do we need systemic change? What is that? We need to really increase very quickly our systems literacy. There's been a lot of work about the key systems, the key economic ecosystems that address very specific societal needs that are required to maintain stability. And you can see, of course, even more right now in a European context, the core challenge we face is not that we do not have solutions. As Al Gore pointed out, we have solutions. We don't have them connected up. We don't have them interrelated. We don't have them available. We have renewable energies, but we don't have the infrastructure and the grid designed to actually manage them effectively and deal with intermittent load and intermittent production. We don't have plugins and charging where we need it. We don't have business models already anticipating the scale that we need now to address something like the energy crisis immediately. And so we're being forced back into short-term responses that lock us harder in or keep us longer in a fossil fuel relationship, which we can ill afford. And that requires us, therefore, to really increase our understanding and our awareness and our capability in thinking in terms of relationships, connectedness. How do you make sure that if you've got a solution on individual energy substitution or alternative energy sources like geothermal, that they're ready, that they're connected, that housing and planning and rule and financial rules and financial subsidies or financial architecture or financing mechanisms are ready to support scaling. And that it's not just simply a question of having solutions that are picking up capital in the market, but that we are designing for the interrelationships, the connections, the integrations that we need to get whole systems change. And we are against a clock. We're against a clock in terms of the exponential pickup in emissions, the effects that is happening on our societies and our economies and our politics, the effects that is having on democratic process. And we're against a clock in terms of a number of interconnected and interrelated effects. If we had to ask ourselves, what does systemic mean and why do we need to think systemic? It's because the problem we're facing and the solutions that we design for are facing into an inherently systemic issue. And systemic means it doesn't behave in neat, linear, straightforward ways. It means what happens to us happens in very non-linear, unpredictable, volatile ways that we don't fully understand, and where the interrelationships between one thing and another thing all of a sudden push a set of dynamics of change in directions that we weren't expecting. We know, for example, that the Greenland ice sheet, one of the core tipping points in this planetary tipping points report and scientific analysis, is the Greenland ice sheet. And we know that the Greenland ice sheet is now pretty much gone. We don't have conditions where the Greenland ice sheet is able to reform sufficiently in winter to hold. The Greenland ice sheet is 6 meters of average sea level rise globally. We don't have cities and businesses prepared for that, really thinking about pulling back production, changing infrastructure. The other thing is we're not just talking about climate, we're talking about biodiversity and environmental structures, which directly affects food systems, forestry, and our ability to create carbon sinks. So we have to be able to try and think both holistically and systemically. Think of the whole planet, think of businesses, global trades, SMEs, individual entities embedded in a system that is connected. And we need to think about the fact that those connections have patterns and relationships and characteristics that don't work in the ways in which we've trained ourselves to think, in linear mechanical log frame processing. So we need, in that case, to address this with innovation. It's absolutely essential for us to transform. Innovation is the core human technology to reinvent ourselves, to transform ourselves so that we can survive, because it is our patterns of living that are the problem, not the planet. It's the human systems of living and human designs for life that are causing issues for us. But that requires us to rethink the way we innovate and the way in which we understand and transform businesses all over the planet. It means we really need to shift from thinking in sectors, in silos, in individual budget lines, in individual responsibilities for budgets and projects, and in a project financing incremental substitution logic, and start to really think about how would we get innovation into the form and shape that is correlated with, that is coherent with the type of dynamics of change we're facing, social, economic, political, from pandemics to energy crisis to the looming food crisis. And that means working with a very different order of design and practice. So what I want to do is just double click a little bit on, so what does that look like? If you're a business, if you're in business, if you're facing into the future, how do you comprehend this? How do you operationalize a way of working on innovation that allows you to face into a climate emergency and understand and see that as an imperative to act, and at the same time, an extraordinary opportunity to seize if you can seize it quickly and deliberately and structurally? The challenge that I see doing the work I'm doing, developing innovation solutions, placing them into markets, market making and market building across Europe and across the world, is that for businesses, We are at a situation now of doing too little and too late. So we must now design for a state of permanent crisis, and that affects decision-making structures and practices. It affects governance, it affects financing, it affects the way in which we think about distributed responsibility, and it affects the way we innovate. We are relying on markets. Can we continue to rely on markets? And the problem is we're iterating on a broken system. We know that one of the fundamental root cause issues we have is consumption economics and growth economics and the role of capital markets in that. So we are going to need to think about how to design businesses for a post-capital markets world. And that's not a thing that I can see most businesses are ready for at all. We continue to operate in business with a lingering assumption that somehow this is about replacement. If we can just replace energy sources that are fossil with renewable, we can get on with life as usual. We will not, and we cannot. And I see businesses continuing to act alone and without the capability needed, without the systems literacy, without preparedness on different forms and practices of innovation, without the deep radical collaboration dynamics that are needed if you're going to be transforming entire value chains and supply chains. And now, in the current context in Europe in particular, the pressure for short-termist measures to hang on to fossil, to try and preserve and subsidize, rather than use this, almost like use jiu-jitsu energy, use this as the ultimate opportunity to transform businesses quickly and now, while the conditions are stable enough to do so. That means thinking in terms of strategic risk. It means acknowledging that there is a way of understanding a future context that is profoundly and structurally disruptive, assuming that that is the case. It's not hard now to assume that. It has been difficult to persuade businesses just how structural and systemic the risks that they face are. Now possibly it's a bit less hard to persuade, but that doesn't give you a solution. The reason why it helps to think in terms of strategic risk is because it provides a structured and a shaped rationale for the commitment of resources, of time and of capital to a program of strategic innovation. And the point of doing that is to design options, alternatives, kind of build alternative realities that you can pull a core business across to, so that you can anticipate business model renewal and you can anticipate resilience. And that is precisely what I want to explain. What does that actually look like? First of all, it means understanding and genuinely comprehending the scale and the nature of the risk itself. Not as, look, this might be a challenge to some of our products and services, how quickly can we diversify, but how comprehensive is this? The biggest possible picture of that is to look at one of the working hypotheses for what happens when we get to 3 to 4 degrees of warming. The green areas on this map are the areas that are still arable land, areas that can still produce food for human beings and for other species. The brown and yellow areas are areas that are far too hot to live in, but could constitute renewable energy grids. It changes your worldview if you start to think, I'm in business and this is the world that is at this point, currently, our default future. Where and how am I placed to survive in that kind of environment with all of its attendant consequences? And of course, attendant consequences come with massive ongoing displacement, refugees at a scale at which we haven't even begun to comprehend. Again, what does that do as a business context? It is a real context. It is one of the things we are already seeing beginning to happen. What happens in a context where you have large geopolitical blocs like Europe really starting to push for a holistic design principle-based transformation of industry, laying down regulatory frameworks and policy frameworks that are asking for industry. In the case of the Industry 5.0 paper that I was involved in writing and presenting to the Commission, this proposes a wholesale change in industrial practice and industrial strategy that asks for a number of core conditional design principles to be embedded in all industries across Europe that are coherent with the type of change we need to get on circularity, on regenerative outcomes, on social well-being and just transition, so that we retain enough political and economic stability to be able to do business in the next 10 to 20 years. And then you have something like this, the signing of the Inflation Reduction Act. If you're in business in Europe, this act offers a 35% subsidy to OPEX, to the bottom line, direct to the bottom line, for businesses going to the US to help the US actively and rapidly decarbonize. That's actually a massive strategic risk for European businesses, watching homegrown businesses quickly go offshore to the US, or it's a massive opportunity to build up European businesses in the US. It constitutes a major discontinuous break in the way in which we've been thinking about our markets and the relationship between the US and Europe. And there is the question of how are you already adjusting to what will need to be a structural redesign in the way in which we think about economics, economic systems, economic models, and our definitions of value. Those are contexts around strategic risk. The way in which you can bring that into a business is to, on the one hand, and you're looking here at a picture of strategic risk on one very specific thing. This has to do with businesses operating in the context of global trade, looking very specifically at the existing set of assumptions that keep a business successful in the current world. In the context of world trade, where you're talking about supply, assumptions and practices around reliable sources of supplies and goods and services, stable societies and political systems, incentives for productive activity that are prepared for domestic consumption, but also for export, ongoing employment in productive activity as a normal focus of human life, relatively open or easy trade agreements, and so on. And a future context that is made very specific. If you're in this business, on the left-hand side of this slide, all of a sudden a future context affects you in quite specific ways. How are you prepared for that? And the purpose of strategic innovation is to explicitly address how would you be prepared to do business in that kind of world. So what I'm arguing for is don't talk about climate emergency as a subcategory of governance or risk or responsibility or corporate social responsibility and sustainability leadership. Talk about it as the context of the entire core business model. Map in and understand where are the multiple manifestations of climate risk, both transition risk in terms of regulation and requirements, say, for example, carbon border setting, or the core structural issues of supply and demand and the physical changes to the world, and start to map them in to a deliberate way of thinking about innovation that is inherently systemic and inherently strategic. In other words, it is looking for a reinvention, a transformation of the core business identity to achieve the kind of change that allows you to survive and grapple with this kind of discontinuous change and turn it into a way of providing solutions that are so deeply embedded in the transformation of economies and societies that you thrive. That means thinking not of plausibility, but of possibility. If any of what I've just described or whipped up on slides is possible, you need to be ready. And your strategy needs to have comprehended that that is possible and have decided to invest in ways in which you would be prepared. The best possible way of being prepared is to generate options, and with options, relationships. So how would you do business in a world where the area of arable land is significantly reduced? How would you do business in a world where 6 meters of sea level rise is actually happening? How do you do business in a world where renewable energies need to be integrated as quickly as possible and core consumption models need to change? How will you do business in the next 3 years when food crisis and food system security starts to be the next major crisis that we are dealing with? And with options, and I'm going to explain what they look like, build the capability as an organization, as a business, to reinvent yourself through learning. In other words, innovation is a way of structuring a set of connected, multiplicitous, kind of multiple simultaneous learning relationships, ways of understanding relationships directly with SMEs, with technology, with startups, with innovation partnerships, industrial partnerships, where you are learning how, on the one hand, to transform a core business model, and on the other hand, to act in uncertainty. And that does mean working across silos. When I'm talking about a strategic option, an innovation option, I'm talking about a possible action that could be executed in the future. And it's an action that would enable you to change the structure and the underpinning assumptions of your core business. So if you're a business that's locked into business-to-business services to oil and gas, how would you execute? What can you leverage in terms of your own assets, your capabilities, your resources that could provide an alternative solution for, say, renewable technologies that would require you to get into a relationship quickly with those actors, with those markets, with those infrastructures, but also with regulatory sandboxes and with partnerships that help you build up the scale and the capability to turn that into your core business model and to transform the whole business. This is an example of an options, just a kind of a bird's eye view of an options portfolio if you're in global trade, where you're starting to work, every single one of these little map points represents a relationship with a particular company or a project that helps you learn about something that would enable you to transform structurally the way you go to market in trade, that would enable you to localize, to think about fractals, to think about how to redesign supply chains into redundant modular systems, that enable you to think about how to relate to new technologies and alternative regulation and so on. And that's really what I'm describing. If I give you an example of, say, working in the area of material production, and you take the Ellen MacArthur Foundation's mapping of what that looks like, you understand it as a system. You start to understand who and what is doing where, who is innovating in every single one of these points, and you build a portfolio, this is only a few of them, that gets you into relationship with every single one of them. And that gets you towards starting to think in terms of multi-sided business models, solutions that combine multiple cash flows simultaneously that are possibly non-correlated in terms of risk or exposure to market. Sundrop Farms in Australia is a fantastic example of that. This is an entrepreneur who bought a parcel of land that was arid, pretty much desert. It's next to the coast, near Adelaide, near Port Pirie. He has set up a system whereby he pipes water from the ocean floor up in pipes, up and across the land. He puts polyurethane tents over the top of that. The heat of the sun and the land condenses the ocean water. The condensation in the tents allows him to grow hydroponic tomatoes, and he has an offtake agreement with Australia's biggest supermarket for 10 years of tomato production. The ocean water evaporating leaves mineral deposits that is used then for fertilizer and for cosmetics. He has solar array, he has wind, and he uses on the pipes up from the ocean, he's got polyurethane sheets to create kelp farming anchored with fish boxes that only catch male fish. So he's got 9 different cash flows, and he's got an underlying value of land that is now 500 multiple. That's the kind of business thinking that we need, 3-dimensional, 4-dimensional business models. In Europe, a company like Novamont is doing something similar, working on bioplastics and biotechnologies, but also requalifying former petrochemical plants as places of production and supply. You have something like Project X. I'm thinking here of explaining these are examples of the kinds of options you would consider wanting to have a relationship with when you're working through a strategic innovation program. This is a program that's a spin out of WWF. It's looking at the 10 most damaging value chains in the world and systematically working with the businesses across them to help them innovate with and through suppliers, supply systems, tax, accounting, audit, technology changes, those supply chains. Or think about something like the Mission Innovation and RISE initiative, which is looking not at solutions on the supply side and the substitution side, but the business models that change demand so that the gigatons of climate innovation, emissions reductions are at stake in climate innovation, not just small amounts of incrementalism. And another example is how then do you think about allocating capital to this? How, as a business in an existing market, dealing with market economics, do you start to actually invest in your own disrupted, transformative future? You can think about optimal capital allocation as a percentage of your present value, as a percentage of net or gross revenue. When you start to say, how much is it worth to me to stay in business in what will be a very disrupted future in the next 3 to 5 years? It's worth 1%, 2%, 4% of revenue to deliberately invest in options that help me work out and build capabilities and relationships for the next generation business model that is climate positive and ideally climate regenerative. That there are many mechanisms and frameworks for doing that. You can run it against stranded assets. You can run it against benchmarks on investment in R&D or investment in risk management. But these are frameworks that help at a board level to connect a good intention with a set of practical, deliberate, systemic and systematic actions. And I'm going to finish just with a couple of comments on who I am and where I'm speaking from. I run an organization called EIT Climate KIC. We are an agency working within Europe and across the world. Our focus is on climate innovation both to reduce greenhouse gas emissions through decarbonization, but also to address adaptation and resilience. And in the context of Europe at the moment, with the European Green Deal, Climate KIC is leading the pilot initiative, the launch initiative of the mission on cities, which is a commitment of 112 missions, 112 cities, my apologies, 100 cities in Europe and 12 cities around the edges of Europe that are committing to a net zero by 2030. That's scope 1 and 2 emissions. And they're committing to decarbonize without offsets, decarbonize fully by 2030. That is a huge market change. That represents a lot of cities trying to work out together how to address energy quickly, how to decarbonize heating, how to electrify transport, how to collectivize demand and change behavior, change market, and think about market-making structures on procurement, on tax, on audit, on pools of capital that are currently really not tapped into because they've all been kept in sectors and silos and individual budgets. So that point about thinking systemically really matters. And these constitute for European business enormous opportunities, market-making potential, because a city decarbonizing means working on every single one of these elements. Electricity, well, the co-benefits on health and well-being, which again produces a set of other cash flows and revenue and savings for city, green spaces, air pollution, waste, job, food, skills, and so on. So the work that's happening here is to apply similar principles to what I was describing in terms of business innovation, to work on the principle of a portfolio that is structured as in around a place. So these are place-based, city-based portfolios that are combining multiple innovations led by the demand. The demand is, how would you decarbonize this city with its particular infrastructure, planning laws, lock-ins on cement or steel, future urban development, air quality, physical climate risks? How would you to take this city to a net zero regenerative position? What leverage points do you have? Can you intervene in rewilding? Can you intervene in water, in waste? Can you change planning laws? Can you look at the way in which the city structures and pools its finance? And the portfolio is really about using multiple solutions together, really pulling in simultaneously a whole lot of different interventions and forcing them and framing them into relationship with one another so that they can start to learn from each other and accelerate and combine their effects. And that means, for example, thinking about how do we do programs on regulation and planning? How do we bring in behavioral change with app-based gamification or car sharing? How do we think about new mechanisms on solar thermal? What can we do with innovative pavement technologies? How do we put accelerate retrofit technologies, particularly in the context of the new European Bauhaus? So what that means is you're talking about a lot of different innovations working together in a particular context and seeking to combine their effects, create multi-sided business models, but also combine co-benefits, numerous co-benefits and economic outcomes. That's what it means to be working in a very systemic way and working with a systems innovation approach. And that is leveraging everything possible. For example, in the European context, within these cities, using wood in construction, both in retrofit and in new build, is a way of literally drawing down carbon, turning our buildings into climate transformation partners. And there are huge framework agreements, and there's a context of the Bauhaus in Europe that is really making it possible to think in those terms. My question back to you would be, again, if you're a business, how do you start to think about this as the markets you're operating in? Think about the way in which you work with investment. This is an initiative that Climate KIC runs on, or is a spin-off from Climate KIC, on transforming the way in which investment capital comes in to invest in that kind of multi-asset investment portfolio, with a place-based portfolio with lots of different solutions integrating and interacting with each other. And on the other hand, thinking about bringing in large-scale structural sovereign wealth and institutional capital in the kind of market-making changes that are happening within the context of the Green Deal and they're called for within European missions. That's a huge opportunity for business. It requires individual businesses to think in terms of success, not as a linear set of outcomes and planning and engineered pathways, but as something in which you are actively learning from multiple points. And I think if I can end on a note of coherence, it is about comprehending the nature of the problem at stake here is peace, it is stability, and it is survival. Business is absolutely essential to that, but business needs to start comprehending its role and its purpose in that context, and actions that are coherent to the scale and the urgency of the changes we need. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kirsten. That was such an insightful presentation, and to actually learn how the changing climate reality can be seen in terms of possibility, not plausibility, and how innovation can drive multi-dimensional business models that are within our planetary limits. So we really hope that you have enjoyed the session. Thank you, Kirsten, once again. It's such a pleasure to listen to someone who speaks with such passion. So thank you again, and hopefully see you soon in other initiatives that we will be running in the future. So now we will move to a second session of today. Second part of the Innovation Fit for Purpose session. So I would like to welcome to the stage Scott Twigg. Scott Twigg, who is a representative of CDP. CDP is a nonprofit organization that runs the global disclosure systems for investors, companies, cities, states, and regions to manage their environmental impacts. Scott is a campaign project officer in the Climate Transition Plan team at the CDP. So Scott, welcome to our event today.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone.
Thank you for joining us. And so now we will start a short interview. I will have a few questions to Scott, and then we will open up the floor to your questions as well. Kirsten will be still here with us, so if you have any questions to Kirsten, we can also ask her. So please leave your questions in the comments. But I will start with the first question, very simple one. Scott, what is CDP and what do you do as an organization?
So CDP runs the only independent global disclosure platform that, as you said, allows companies, cities, states, and regions to disclose their impact on the environment. And they can do so through several questionnaires that we have on our disclosure platform online. And they're for the themes of climate change, forest, and water security. And this really draws down to the basic that you can't know the impacts on the climate unless you're being transparent about your operations as a business or as a financial institution. So what we really hold core is transparency and accountability. And I believe it's somewhere between 2/3 of the world's GDP now discloses through CDP. And last year we saw around 14,000 companies globally disclose to CDP for their impacts on the climate. And year on year, we wish to expand the suite of organizations that disclose to us, but also develop our questionnaires to capture those really important forward-looking and granular data points on the impacts on our on our world. So you can visit our CDP webpage to kind of find out more. But yeah, it's a pleasure to be here today to represent CDP and to, of course, talk about the important subject of transition planning.
Thank you. And so my question would be one that is really interesting to me. Just as CDP, you have published a report, Are Companies Being Transparent About Their Transition? And it is actually a result of your work with companies and how in supporting them in disclosing the information about their climate transition plans. What are the key findings and recommendations from that report?
So the aim of this report was to perform a kind of global stock take of transition relevant disclosure. So specifically, we were looking at how well companies disclose to every element of a credible climate transition plan in their 2021 disclosure to the climate change questionnaire. The report also broke up that analysis regionally and sectorally and kind of zoomed in on specific areas such as financial planning. Some key findings of the report include that only 1% of organizations who reported to CDP in 2021 disclosed against all the indicators that CDP had identified that signal that they have a credible climate transition plan in place. To put this into perspective, 4,000 organizations, disclosed to CDP that they had a transition plan that year. So we have one specific question, which is C3.1, where that organization can disclose if they have a climate transition plan that aligns with that 1.5 degree world that we want to see. And out of those 4,000 organizations, only 135 organizations disclosed to all of those data points that we have identified that kind of signal a robust and credible climate transition plan. So kind of as a high level finding, we can see that we have a kind of very long way to go. There were some other sectors that performed relatively well. The financial service sector, the power sector, and the fossil fuel sector had the highest rate of disclosure of climate transition plans, with, 5% of organizations within those industries reporting to all of those key climate transition plan indicators throughout the questionnaire. Whereas the transportation service and I believe the apparel industry had the lowest disclosure rate, with 0.3% of those organizations disclosing to all those indicators. And if we take a step back and remember the amount of organizations that disclose the CDP, which is roughly 14,000, we're dealing with very minute numbers of organizations that are kind of credibly disclosing their transition plan. In a kind of regional outlook, there was no G20 country with over 4% of organizations headquartered in their jurisdiction that disclosed against those key indicators. However, organizations in Singapore and the Netherlands performed slightly better. I think they had a average of 6% disclosure to all those key indicators. But again, kind of on that trend that we can see, we have a kind of significant way to go. So with the work that CDP has done this year, updating our guidance and releasing papers on transition plannings, we can really see or hope to see an increase in these numbers as we perform the same analysis this year on 2022 disclosures.
And what do you do as CDP? What are the initiatives that you run to facilitate this transition to sustainable business models, or to support companies to be more transparent about their climate transition plans?
So CDP's current scoring already incentivizes the disclosure of transition plans, and that's because all of our disclosures are incentivized through our scoring methodology. So when an organization discloses to CDP, we assess the quality of that disclosure, and then we publish a score, depending on if they had disclosed in the past beyond 1 year, because if they disclosed the first year, that score is left private. And you can see those scores on our webpage. If you go to CDP's homepage, get to the bottom of the page, and you can type in an organization and see how well they disclosed last year, and the score that they were awarded for that disclosure. So as those indicators are dispersed through the climate change questionnaire, we already do incentivize the disclosure and the development of those plans through that methodology. And we will look to kind of develop our questionnaire further as we do year on year, to kind of capture those more transition relevant, forward-looking, granular data points that signal the kind of robustness and credibility of transition plans, but specifically to maybe initiatives to facilitate the development. For organizations, if anyone here is a stakeholder or represents an organization that has disclosed the CDP in the past, I'd recommend looking into our reporter service membership, and that provides our members with a tailored disclosure support and analysis to continually improve your disclosure year on year. And of course, that will speak to transition planning as well. We offer another service called our supply chain membership, which can also facilitate the transition and the development of those plans. The supply chain membership enables our members to request that their supplier companies disclose the CDP, with the full backing of other supply chain members as well, kind of co-signing letters to request that engagement. This means that kind of from that increased disclosure of suppliers, that there can be a heightened level of scope 3 emission accounting and engagements that can follow from that request to kind of continually improve that disclosure across that organization's value chain. Specifically, though, to transition plans, CDP, myself, I run an annual transition plan campaign, and we'll be launching the second edition of the transition campaign this year, which aims to scale up response data to those specific transition relevant indicators throughout the climate change questionnaire. In 2021, the campaign was supported by 7 capital market signatories that had a 1.4 trillion in assets, and we were also supported by 5 supply chain members with over 2 trillion in total procurement spend. Those campaign supporters targeted over 900 companies that disclosed the CDP in 2021, asking those organizations to improve their transition relevant disclosure in 2022. So the campaign itself is open to financial institutions or what we call our CDP capital market signatories. And those are financial institutions that support the CDP disclosure request that goes out to organizations annually to request that they disclose the CDP. And it's also open to our supply chain members. And what it does is it supports their efforts to cascade that transition across their portfolio or their value chain or supply chain companies. And this is really, really important because transition plans should cut across the value chain and portfolios where, financed or indirect emissions are located, which are, of course, tied to science-based targets that organizations set. And there are also kind of real resiliency risks within supply chains and portfolios that organizations really need to try and mitigate within their credible plan and start engaging organizations, within that portfolio or value chain. The campaign itself provides our supporters with a data insight into how well an organization has disclosed last year to those 24 indicators, allowing them to internally benchmark or identify organizations that they want to engage with. And it also sends engagement letters to those companies to signal that their investor or their purchaser has analyzed their disclosure, is either not happy with it and wants them to improve that this year, or speak to them on a kind of one-to-one basis. So I'm really looking forward to launching the campaign this year. We're currently recruiting. So, if anyone in this room is, works for or represents or has stakeholder interest with an organization that disclosed to CDP last year, is a supply chain member or a financial institution, I'd really recommend reaching out to me. I can share my email address, and I would look forward to kind of starting a call and see if they can join the campaign.
Thanks, Scott. This was actually my next question, but let me go to another one. The main question I had for you today, which connects to the topic of today's meeting, is that based on your experience and based on CDP's experience, what makes a successful climate transition plan, and what is the role of innovation in that process?
So let's tackle the first question first on what makes a transition plan successful, or in CDP's language, what makes a transition plan credible, because we're really looking for at CDP that the right information is contained within that plan. The guidance landscape for transition plans has moved rapidly over the last kind of 2 years. And amazingly, we've kind of seen this juxtaposition to kind of the typical movement within this space where legislation has actually outpaced the private sector, whereas typically we've seen, particularly in terms of science-based targets, that the private sector has really kind of led the way when it comes to kind of climate leadership and stewardship. But we've seen kind of post COP26 last year, this kind of rapid acceleration of legislation and regulation relating to climate transition plans. The TCFD updated their guidance last year to include transition plans. The ISSB formulation has recommendations around transition plans in their most recent exposure draft. GFANZ has released guidance on transition plans, CA100+. So we've seen that this kind of space has become, really complex and convoluted. So what CDP has kind of attempted to do is synthesize all this guidance and formulate a kind of well-supported and robust framework that can apply to any sector in any jurisdiction, that summarizes kind of what a successful and credible climate transition plan should look like. So the nature of planning can be very complex, and the way I like to look at it is it's always best to compartmentalize what should constitute that plan. And that makes it significantly easier to understand what should be contained within it, and therefore what makes it successful. It's also really important to understand that no transition plan will look the same. There has to be nuances from organization to organization based on their sector, jurisdiction, size, scope of emissions, and so on. But to kind of break what makes a transition plan successful down, I like to imagine a pyramid structure. And at the top of that pyramid is the definition of that transition plan. And CDP has defined a credible climate transition plan as a time-bound action plan that clearly outlines how an organization will achieve its strategy to pivot its existing assets, operations, and entire business model towards a trajectory that aligns with the most ambitious climate science recommendation. And that is, of course, halving our emissions by 2030 and reaching net zero by 2050 at the latest. So below that layer is the guiding principles of a credible climate transition plan. And these should guide the development of that transition plan, and they should be, pardon me, evidenced kind of throughout that plan. And they are in kind of no particular order: accountability, internally coherent. The plan should be forward-looking. It should be time-bound and quantitative with KPIs. It should be flexible and responsive to a kind of changing climate and business environment. And it should be complete, so it should cover the whole organization. And I will share kind of materials that goes into more detail on kind of what these individual elements are. So if we travel down the pyramid, below those guiding principles are the elements that kind of constitute that plan that, again, should be evidenced in the development and disclosure of that plan. And in no particular order, they include governance, scenario analysis, financial planning, value chain engagement and low carbon initiatives, policy engagement, risk and opportunities, target and scope 1, 2, and 3 accounting with verifications. So as I kind of touched on, when speaking about the guiding principles, these elements of a transition plan shouldn't only be kind of within the plan and reflected within that plan, they should also be evidenced within the disclosure of those plans. And CDP has mapped our questionnaire to those relevant elements of a climate transition plan. And this means that any organization that discloses to CDP is able and should disclose their transition plan to CDP and all those elements, of course, that constitute that plan. And that's really how we perform the analysis for the report that we spoke about earlier. We broke down those elements into question level analysis, and we could assess whether or not organizations were disclosing sufficiently to those individual elements or all of those elements of a credible climate transition plan. So kind of a whistle-stop tour on what constitutes a kind of successful or credible plan. So let's turn to innovation. So innovation is a kind of loose term. It can really be applied to kind of any area, particularly of a transition plan. So it can be applied to the planning phase, but also the implementation phase as well. So innovation, when it comes to planning, you could be innovative with how you finance certain areas of your transition plan, how you allocate your capital expenditure, to align with that kind of 1.5 degree world. But if we maybe focus on implementation, innovation really applies to that action phase of a climate transition plan. So it really is whatever lever an organization has available to decarbonize their business model. So some examples of that decarbonization innovation can include, low carbon products or services. So how an organization can utilize their R&D investment within their portfolio to drive optimization or decarbonization of their suites of their suite of products. We can have low carbon initiatives within transition plans, so that can be within a production process or energy consumption or generation on site. So that could be switching to biofuels or using EV solar power. But innovation doesn't necessarily just have to apply to a business operation. As I spoke about, or maybe touched on earlier, a transition plan should really cover the value chain of an organization. They need to think about how they can engage supply chain companies to drive down those indirect emissions, those scope 3 emissions that are located kind of within their supply chain. So that means that a company could be innovative with how it engages with their supply chain, how it goes about setting conditions within procurement contracts that maybe their suppliers need to set science-based targets, by 2030 at the latest, or they need to think about developing their own transition plan and ensuring that there's those correct governance structures and accountability structures in place. And innovation can also apply to kind of engagement beyond that supply chain, where the organization should use its agency to influence and lobby policy to create an environment where their transition can take place in a kind of transformative sense, where their jurisdiction that they're in can also move towards a future that is aligned with that net zero carbon economy. So innovation should be evidenced and kind of cut through a transition plan all the way from the top of that pyramid, thinking about how those guiding principles will be applied to the development of that plan, but also in that kind of implementation phase about using the levers that our organization has available to kind of drive optimization and decarbonization and actually begin to go on that journey of transition beyond that kind of planning phase.
Thank you so much, Scott. I actually believe that there are more questions to Scott, and I wish we had a bit more time to discuss those, but we will need to move to another session now. So thank you again for joining us today. And if you would like to connect with Scott, you can do that in the networking space. So Scott will stay with us later for the remainder of the event. So once again, thank you to Scott, and thank you to Kirsten, who joined us